Daredevil Born Again has a superhero problem. And I don't mean to say that I think it's a problem that Matt Murdock has only been in the Daredevil costume at the start of the first season. Here we are 4 episodes in. No, it's actually quite the opposite. Daredevil Born Again is very skeptical about the role of superheroes, and I think that's great. In fact, I think that's something unique among superhero stories altogether. And I know that some of you are hearing that and you're thinking, well, yeah, but that's going to change because at the end of the 4th episode, Matt goes up onto the roof and he gets his baton and he's practicing his baton, and we know that Daredevil's coming. As excited as you and I are about seeing Matt make his return to Daredevil, Matt's not excited about it. And moreover, the show isn't really excited about it either. But that only makes sense when we look at that moment where Matt goes on the roof within the context of the series so far, and especially episode 4. Born Again's first season, at least so far, has been all about Matt losing his faith in the law. The first episode begins, obviously, with Dex, aka Bullseye, appearing and killing a bunch of people, including Foggy Nelson, Matt's best friend. And when we jump ahead a year later, we see that Matt has given up his Daredevil persona. He thinks that Vigilantism is wrong. He thinks that Vigilantism has somehow made people like Bullseye possible, and he's afraid of how willing he was to kill Bullseye after Foggy dies. And so instead he puts all of that behind him, and he puts his faith in the law. And almost immediately, Wilson Fisk becomes the mayor of New York City. There are all sorts of corrupt cops. Even when he gets Hector Ayala acquitted, Hector is then gunned down. So by the time we get to episode 4, Matt's trust in the law is at its lowest. And there's 2 interesting things in that 4th episode that really put Matt's position into focus. One, of course, is the conversation with Frank Castle, aka the Punisher. We'll get to that in just a second. The other that's a little bit, I don't want to use subtle because the story arc isn't subtle at all, but maybe it can get lost in light of, maybe it's so loud in making its sort of political point that we can lose the thematic point that it's also making. And I'm referring here to Matt's interactions with Leroy, played by Charlie Hudson III. For those of you that don't remember, Leroy is a person who at the start of the episode gets caught shoplifting from a bodega. He steals a couple of boxes of caramel corn. He is sentenced to 30 days in prison. Matt takes a pro bono case where he's going to represent this guy, and right away, Leroy does nothing to endear himself to Matt or to the audience. He's making fun of the fact that Matt is blind. He's loud and he's obnoxious. He's demanding probation when the minimum is 30 days, especially for a repeat offender. And when Matt uses his considerable charm, when Matt comes back and he says, hey, I got you down to 10 days, Leroy is not impressed and is irritated. And we are, as viewers, 100% on Matt's side. And then Leroy gives this speech. Now, I have to say that, aesthetically speaking, I don't think that this moment is very well done. The actor goes a little too big. Choral music starts playing as he's talking. But the point is sound on a social level, and it's sound on a thematic level. Leroy goes on to explain all of the difficulties that he faces. As a black man in America, he is subject to all sorts of harassment, and especially as a poor black man, his life is continuously precarious. Even small things that knock him down have huge ramifications. And it leads to this point where he says, the system would rather spend 5 times more to keep me in jail than it would to feed me. Again, on a social level, this is a potent point, and one that we rarely see in genre. That speaks to the more complex approach to justice and law and order that Daredevil Born Again has. Because while it's making that political point, it's also making a thematic point. Because Matt, who is trying to be a believer in the law, is seeing that the law is unequal. Why is the government throwing the book at Leroy here? Well, also, the literal kingpin of crime is allowed a position of power like being the mayor of New York City. That's the thing that really breaks Matt. and he completely loses his faith in the legal system. And so we might, in light of what Leroy said, get to the end where Matt goes on the roof and he's doing his cool baton thing and go, yeah, Daredevil's back to put things right. That would make sense, except of the context that happens in the rest of that episode when we see the other two people who are also no longer putting their faith in the law. The more surprising of these two is Wilson Fisk himself. We get that conversation where he's talking about his plan to renovate the docks, and he says, we're going to go get this going, and his chief of staff stops him and says, you can't just bully these things through. There's bureaucratic red tape, which leads to the moment where he goes to talk to Frank Castle. Now, Matt is there, at least on the surface level, because he's investigating the death of Hector Ayala, and he finds that bullet with the Punisher logo on it, and so he goes and talks to Frank. And of course, Frank is not the one who did it. I won't tell you who did it. We'll talk about that later with another video. However, as Frank points out, Matt's not actually there for information, nor is he there to charge or accuse Frank. He's there for permission, because at this moment, Matt is starting to see things the same way that Frank sees them. Matt feels like he should have probably killed Bullseye. Matt feels that the system is broken, that he needs to kill Kingpin, because the law is too concerned with the guy who steals caramel corn and not, the kingpin of crime. And this leads to the moment where Matt goes onto the roof and starts throwing his baton around. Within the context of the show, this is a bad thing, because this is Matt backsliding, to use, I think, an appropriate religious term. This is Matt going to the devil, because he's given up faith in the law. He believes in this moment that only vigilantism is going to solve this. Now, a lot of superhero shows would agree with Matt's position that the law is broken and a vigilante is the thing that's going to save it. But because this episode aligns that position with Wilson Fisk and with Frank Castle, I don't care for the Punisher very much at all, but I do like the way that the show depicts Frank Castle as a broken man. Because it aligns it with this, that's a problem. Because ultimately, the show understands that when we lose faith in systems, and moreover, when we lose faith in civil society, then we are sinking towards despair and fascism. And Matt's turn towards returning to Daredevil is coming out of a motivation that's connected towards that despair, that nihilism, that fascism. Now, this is halfway through the season, and I'm not going to give anything away, but I really like where the show goes. But for right now, it's really interesting that Born Again is interrogating the whole idea of vigilantes and their relationship to failed social systems.